Standard must be experiencing an ancestral recall the way that Izzet and Dimir are back on top. What else is up there in the metagame share? Find out right now. This weekend was jam-packed with Standard Magic the Gathering action, as there were 2 regional championships happening in the continental area of North America, one over in Vancouver, Canada, and the other one in Milwaukee, Wisconsin within the US, and there were thousands of players slinging spells across both of the events. And even though Standard is feeling really good right now, there's a large variety of decks that appeared at both tournaments, it did wind up being 2 of the usual suspects that walked away with the trophy in an Izzet Lessons deck and a Dimir Midrange deck between the 2 events. Now what we're going to do is take both of these events and smash them together into one metagame breakdown. So we are going to be looking at the overall metagame between both of the events, and then taking a look at that wide metagame and narrowing it down to just the most popular decks, and then comparing those archetypes against one another within those tiers. You kind of have an idea of what may be played at your store championships or during the remainder weekends of your RCQ season for Standard. Then we're going to be looking at the top 10 win rates 2 different ways. The first one has no sample size required, so 1 deck is all you need to have made this list, while the other one is going to be focusing on decks with at least 4 copies in the room or higher. This is going to be where you're really going to find some of those standard brews that could potentially shift some things in the metagame. After that, we are going to be looking at the top 10 presence decks and looking at their win rates in the head-to-head matchup matrix against one another. So if you're looking at playing one of the more popular or metagame decks and you want to know what your good and bad matchups are for your own local tournaments coming up, this is going to be where you're going to want to kind of buckle down and look at those numbers there. Now, before we get started, of course, I need to talk about where our data is coming from, and we are using the Melee Platforms reporting system for both of the events. Now, because there are 1,433 different decks between the 2 events, and I've combined them, there were some naming differences between the different deck archetypes that we are going to have to kind of condense down into things. Now, there were no players that had no deck list attached, although some of them did have some troll deck lists that were just either named incorrectly or a bunch of random cards with no actual way to win the game, like no lands or anything like that. But we've been able to kind of condense all of those deck archetypes down, and while some of them have just been renamed a little bit, like different versions of Dimir Midrange from different versions of what we come to expect, and separating them out by some of the highlight cards like Oil Deep Gearhulk, to renaming lists that were just named incorrectly, like trying to find a bunch of the hidden Izzet Lessons decks that were under a bunch of different archetype names all over the place. I've had a bit of the change log over on my social medias if you want to try to find that. It's linked in the Reddit thread. I'll try to put it down in the description below as well if you want to go over some of all the archetype changes I've gone through. However, we are going to be going through both of the events all the way through, including the top 8. And remember, buys do not count in the win rate statistics. Ties do, unless we're looking at win rate minus ties. So we got a bunch of all the data stuff out of the way. So let's just hop into what Canada and the US were bringing to Standard. Across both RC events, we wound up having 118 unique deck archetypes between the 2 events. It does wind up counting that one person on the bottom right there that had trolled deck lists. So congratulations, you've made the recap. However, you are one of 48 different deck archetypes that were the sole copy in either Canada or the United States, making up 40.7% of the deck archetype share. You want to expand that to look at decks that had at least 2 copies between the events. There are 13 archetypes making up 11% of the deck metagame share. Looking at deck archetypes that had at least 3 copies between the events, there's 12 of those. That makes up 10.2% of this deck archetype share. We want to expand that to looking at archetypes with at least 4 copies between the events. There's 8 of those. That's 6.8% of this share. Decks with at least 5 copies between the events had 6 different archetypes for 5.1% of this deck share metagame, and then flip that because decks with at least 6 copies in the room, there were 5 archetypes. That's not confusing to say back to back, but it's a 4.2% share statistic, which is much easier to understand. Now, if you want to look at different deck archetypes that had at least 7 copies, where these are starting to get a little bit more realistic to play, there are 3 different deck archetypes for 2.5% of this share. We then skip to different archetypes with at least 9 copies in the room. It was just a solo bolo, 0.8% of the metagame share here. tier. And if we're looking at all the different deck archetypes that had at least double-digit copies between the two events, this is where we're going to see a lot of these kind of focusing of the metagame for Standard. There were 22 different archetypes, making up 18.6% of the deck share metagame overall, which is larger than any other percentage besides the singleton deck copies. So yeah, you have the people bringing their own brews or these different rogue decks that are going to outclass the people bringing in these more metagame decks. However, 22 different decks that people consider metagame viable is a pretty healthy format overall. All right, let's take a look at some of those top metagame presence decks of that healthy format. Now, the biggest one, of course, is going to be Izzet Lessons. 149 different decks was 10.4% of the field across both of the events. Even though it was the most played deck, it is the only deck with a double-digit percentage of the metagame share, and 10.4% is not a ton, so that just goes to show how varied this list is going to be. Mono Green Landfall is next in line with 128 different pilots across the two events, making up 8.9% of the deck metagame share. Mono Green Landfall's been on the up and up in the past couple events, and it's finally ticked over into that top tier of decks to play in Standard. Dimir Excruciator, of course, winner of the Pro Tour and still hanging on for potentially one of the better Dimir decks in the format, had 117 copies between the two events, making up 8.2% of the metagame share. But then not to be counted out, Dimir Midrange, Old Faithful, is right below it. 101 copies and 7% of the metagame share, not to mention taking a trophy home as well in Canada. Simic Rhythm is down, but not out. It winds up making it here in 5th place overall. 94 different pilots sleeved up their Cubs and Quantum Riddlers for 6.6% of the metagame. The Azorius Tempo deck, which is something that I have had my eyes on for quite some time, is finally showing up in numbers, very close to the Dimir Midrange deck, but not quite. 82 different copies for 5.7% of the metagame share. Izzet Spellementals, still as fun to say as it is to play, 68 different copies of that deck, made up 4.7% of the metagame share. Right underneath it, Izzet Elementals, just to give us a bit of a tongue twister, had 61 different pilots for 4.3% of the RC metagame. And then Izzet Prowess, I'm sensing a trend here as far as colors are concerned, 54 different decks for 3.8% of the metagame. And then Izzet... Oh, they added white to this one. Jeskai Control, just below that one, rounding out our top 10 presence decks, 53 different decks for 3.7% of the metagame share. Now it's time for us to shift gears away from what made up the event as a whole and just focus on what was most popular at the event using my popularity tier analysis. Now this section looks to identify what was played the most at an event and compare it to the other decks within the same tier of popularity using a distribution of deck archetypes at the event, which uses standard deviation to assign tiers from D at 1 deviation below the average all the way up to S, the highest deviation above the average. Now this does a little more than just look at how high the metagame share was and can reaffirm if a deck was a good choice for an event at all. Now while this is not a be-all end-all overview of the format, this analysis looks to help in preparation for your own events at your LGS or online, as you can expect to see more of the higher tier decks compared to the lower tier ones, but then you can also assess if you need to prepare more or less for them based on their performance. Well, there's a lot of S-tier decks, and I think this is one of the first times in one of these recaps that we've had so many different deck archetypes in the S-tier popularity. Just goes to show that there are powerful decks that are also popular that have some staying power in Standard. Now, taking a look at the best performing deck of these S-tier decks, it's actually the Mono Green Landfall list. Now, this list has kind of wax and wane with the number of players on whether it was a top 10 win rate deck, if it was just a high win rate deck, or whether it's one of the best decks in the format in general. When you compare it against all of the other different deck archetypes within S tier, it stands out as the most winning of those archetypes. So it just goes to show that no matter how many pilots you have on the Landfall deck and how many pilots are playing that try to spread its win rate all across, it is a powerful force to be reckoned with and the best aggro deck to be playing in Standard right now. That doesn't mean that it is the best de facto deck in the format though. Izzet Lessons has been persevering for a very long time in the format and is once again at a 52.6% win rate overall, as the most popular deck in the field. That just goes to show that the strength of this deck and the tenacity of its pilots, as well as just the amount of practice that people picking up the deck are putting in, just puts it a step above some of the other decks in the format. Now, this is, of course, is ebbing and flowing with the way that the format is going, as a bunch of the decks were targeting Cub decks previously. We saw Izzet lessons shoot up, and as they continue to target decks like Landfall, they're going to be playing a bunch of creatures. Lesson stocks are only going to go up from there. The pair of Dimir decks within here are going to be a little bit polarizing. Dimir Excruciator is a known quantity at this point and has fallen down as a 47.3% win rate deck. This goes to show that while it was very successful at the Pro Tour and in the week or so following, as people are kind of coming hip to what it's doing, it's falling off in power a little bit overall. It's actually the lowest win rate out of all these decks here. Now, Temur Midrange wears its mantra of pretty average deck in the format. 50.1% win rate with a high play rate does go to show that there are some legs to Dimir Midrange after all, and that rumors of its demise have been greatly exaggerated. The Simic Rhythm deck, or the Simic Badgermole Cub-based deck, has popped back up in popularity after being beat on by the rest of the metagame for a while, but after a performance last week where it was above 50% win rate in a smaller field across two larger RC events, it has fallen back down below 50% win rate, as a lot of these decks are now packing early game removal for the Cubs and are just kind of able to deal with what it was doing compared to the previous iterations of Standard where you were more focused on the Lessons deck. So it just goes to show that Lessons and Mono Green are still very powerful decks to contend with, but any of these S tier decks could potentially wind up having a good weekend if you play them right. Now, while there are a lot of decks in S tier, A tier is stretched a little bit thinner, although there are two different decks here. The Azorius Tempo deck was something that I had my eye on for a while, and it's been basically performing pretty well no matter how many pilots are taking it to these events. Now, in its first really large-scale performance, 82 pilots compared to like somewhere in the teens was the most I've seen at some of the other recaps, it still has a 50.3% win rate overall. Playing against this deck as one of the rhythm decks is a pain. When they lay down a high noon, it not only shuts off all of your mono ramp basically because your Badgermole Cubs can no longer play multiple things in a turn, but it means that your powerful cards that you can ramp out one at a time are contested by Even Interrupters and Aang Swift Saviors and even No More Lies. So it's just a very difficult deck to contend with if you're trying to do something fair or bigger because, well, it stops that. The Izzet Spellementals deck has also kind of surged up in win rate overall after a slightly lower win rate in the last couple of weekends of events. 51.2% win rate overall just goes to show as more and more decks are playing more and more creatures, being able to bounce all of the non-elementals back to their hand with Sunderflog, and still playing some pretty powerful beaters like Eddie Mert Crab ahead of schedule are going to not only tap down crucial attackers, but also trade up in value for things that your opponents aren't necessarily expecting. So you're slinging spells and doing thing in the ice type things, or you're taking it and playing it more of like a taxes deck while you're in A tier. Both of these decks are looking pretty solid to play in a metagame near you. B tier is where things get a little bit more polarizing, however, and by that I mean Jeskai Control is unfortunately the laughingstock of these standard popularity tiers right now. The lowest win rate overall at 33.3%, not only in B tier, but for this popularity breakdown. Spoiler alert. Jeskai pilots need to figure out the configuration for their controlled shells because it is changing. It needs to change anyway with the way that the standard metagame is adopting. Used to be very good against the Cub decks, however, Izzet Lessons is not playing as many creatures. Dimir Excruciator is playing the control game alongside you with a combo finish. Mono Green Landfall has a lot of tenacity with its fetch lands, earthbending, and bossing say. The way that you are dealing with Cub decks is not the way you're going to be able to deal with these decks, and unless you diversify the way that you are attacking the metagame, Jeskai Control is going to continue to be on the lower end of the win rate. But let's talk positives, like Izzet Prowess. We're going to be talking about this deck a lot in the video, spoiler alert, but it kind of popped up out of nowhere after kind of falling off the face of the earth when Vivi got banned way a long time ago. 57.6% win rate goes to show that proactivity is definitely something that we will be able to capitalize on in the standard format right now. This deck is still running slick shot show-offs and wild rides like it's a couple of years ago, and it's still putting up powerful results. The Izzet Elementals deck, which is mostly going to be an ETB roaming throne type deck, looking to get a lot of mid-range value, had a 50.4% win rate. It just goes to show that you can take things slower in this standard metagame, especially if you are playing powerful effects either twice or ahead of curve. Boros Dragons continues to be the sort of surprise of the standard format, and it seems to be that every single player I talk to doesn't really get why it's doing as well as it is right now. 52.7% win rate for the big bad dragon deck. Being able to play these things ahead of curve thanks to cards like Momo and Sarkhan and the static effects that the dragons have is punishing in the metagame. They can't deal with a big threat like some of these aggro decks, you stonewall them. They can't deal with the ETB effect or the static effect like a Clarion Conqueror, you stonewall them. So while the Boros Dragons deck kind of looks like this big Timmy Stompy deck, it's actually doing some pretty intricate hate bear and pseudo ramp things, which puts it above the curve at a 52.7% win rate, and actually should be something you're considering if your metagame is going to wind up having decks like Landfall and Cub decks that can be affected by these ETBs. C tier is massive, and while I'm going to say I won't talk about all the deck archetypes here specifically, I might wind up, whether it's now or later in the video. However, I do want to address a couple of the winners on the weekend: Banned Airbending, Gruul Landfall, and Dimir Control, all 50% or above win rate, just slightly above here, doing a bunch of different things. The Airbending deck is a little bit harder for some of the more controlling shells to interact with, and is one of the more successful Cub decks in this list here, with a 50.7% win rate overall. Combo finish, creatures to deal with, very difficult to interact with cards in exile as well, so you can't really approach it to hate it out in the normal ways you would. Now, the Dimir Control deck, this is one of the decks that I've had on my radar, and if you are one of my members, I suggested playing this or Izzet Lessons in the last couple of weekends of events. 50.5% win rate overall. The Dimir Control deck and the Dimir Excruciator deck do have some overlap, but I do like the tools that you get when you're not running the combo package. You still have the Restless Reef and things to help you end games. You just don't have that sort of kind of like quote-unquote I win button, and you're not wind up running triple black spells in your deck to wind up weirding up your mana base a little bit. I like this version of the Dimir shell a little bit better, although Dimir Midrange has definitely picked up, and well, we all know how much I like that deck. I do want to call out some of the more interesting decks here, such as the Rakdos Monument deck. 44.6% win rate overall is not quite where you want it to be. However, I do think it's doing some pretty cool things and may just wind up being a little bit on the short end of the stick due to how much creature hate is currently in the format, and of course some of the artifact hate floating around as well. Now, the Grixis Elementals deck, which is kind of going to be close to a 4-color style of deck, but also very similar to what the Izzet Elementals deck is doing, has a lower win rate overall, which just goes to show that splashing some of the different cards and trying to get some of that quote-unquote scam value out of your Elementals isn't as good as just playing a straight-up quote-unquote fair mid-range game when you're doubling things with your roaming throne. Similarly, in 3-color decks, Sultai Reanimator kind of came back a little bit overall, but its pilot rate has dropped as well. Only 23 different decks had a 45.8% win rate, which is up from the dredges of the 30-something% it was in the previous couple of weekends. And Temur Harmonizer is slowly kind of stabilizing at this sub 50% win rate deck archetype. I do think that as people kind of figure out how to interact with it, even though it has control style elements to it, a lot of players are continuing to play it like a combo deck. And if you don't have your control lines down, you just try to go for your combo. People have figured out when to be able to hold up their interaction and kind of when to see it coming, and they know that if they have one or two ways to interact as opposed to just the one, that they are going to survive or at least be able to bluff being able to. Now, the Izzet Blink deck is also something on this list that I want to call out. I want to play against this in my store championship this past weekend. 40.6% win rate overall. Again, these scam elements or these scam aspects to these decks aren't working out necessarily as well as just playing kind of straight up mid-range Magic. So that's going to be something I think you should kind of not think about playing if you are in the Izzet colors, because there's so many other Izzet decks to choose from, even just in this popularity tier. Let's step away from the popularity contest and instead look at what decks were doing the most winning, regardless of how many copies were in the room at the event. Now, this is going to be looking at overall win rate in the percentage of games won, not total wins or total games played. This is going to allow us to look for some of those sleeper OP decks, even though they weren't out in full force this weekend, and it's going to be able to put that in perspective based on how successful they were in the hands of smaller amounts of pilots. Now, the caveat is these are 2-day events, which means that some of these lists could have not made day 2 despite having a positive record. So as always, keep in mind the sample size because it does matter when you're thinking about breaking the format. All right, Jeskai lessons. Let's talk about this brew in air quotes by Kyle Gellert, the pilot who went 10-4-0 this weekend playing the deck. It's Izzet lessons, splashing 4 Hollowed Fountain and 1 Sacred Foundry. Now, I actually had to do a quick Scryfall search to see how many white lessons there actually were in Standard, because I know there's been a bunch printed in Jumpstart, or at least a bunch of random white cards I've never seen before. And although there are 5 white lessons in the format, there are 0 in this list whatsoever. Now, instead, what Kyle did was splashed 5 white sources to be able to eventually cast one of 3 copies of Jeskai Revelation in the Izzet list. Now, Jeskai Revelation in and of itself is one of the most powerful reasons to be playing Jeskai Control in the format. Now, when you take that and put it in the Lessons deck, which is drawing cards, making treasures, doing a bunch of things throughout its game plan, you actually add 2 1/1 white monk creatures with prowess to that. You get to gain some life, you get to deal some damage. It just kind of ups the closing speed a little bit, which is weird to say for a 7 mana spell. Now, is this something that the Lessons deck needs in order to succeed? No. We know how powerful the Lessons shell is. Is this something cool to see being tried out? Hell yeah, it is. And for all you Jeskai pilots who are a little distraught about your deck not necessarily firing on all cylinders, maybe you just pick this up and play it for a couple FNMs and see how you like it. The 4-color rhythm decks get their name from the fact that they have 4 different colors of creatures in their main deck that they're trying to actually cast. Superior Spider-Man and Bright Glass Gearhulk are the ones that pop up the most frequently, such as in Daniel Genova's 10-5-0 list at the RCs from this past weekend. Now, these lists all together play very similar to the Simic, the Band, all the different rhythm shells. However, it was very well positioned this weekend and wound up picking up a 60.8% win rate overall, whether it was non-mirrors, no ties, or just overall win rate to begin with. Now, what the 4-color version of this deck is doing well is something along the lines of Tristan's old RC Portland list, where it has a plethora of different creatures to fetch from and a plethora of different spells to find off of Bright Glass Gearhulk. So you have tutors for different specific creatures in certain scenarios, such as being able to find your Ouroboros or Crater Hoop Behemoth to help end the game, or things like Insidious Fungus, said Superior Spider-Man, or things from the sideboard like Reclamation Sages, Voice of Victories, Doorkeeper Thralls, whatever you really need to lock your opponent out of the game, or an answer to what they are trying to do. Now, it does have these same kind of effects that the Simic deck does by having 4 copies of Quantum Riddler, the 4 Badger Mole Cubs, and can just end a game out of nowhere on turn number 3. But this one is also able to leverage Formidable Speaker thanks to Superior Spider-Man to have that oh-so-juicy combo of binning an Ouroboros, bringing it back with Spider-Man, and immediately putting 4 counters on everything for the win. Azorius Otters is one of the more interesting decks to pop up this weekend, and while this isn't necessarily a deck tech video, this is a combo deck, and you kind of have to understand what's going on to really see why these lists, specifically the 11-4-0 list by pilot Christopher Henderson, were able to pick up so many different game wins. Now, of course, everything when it comes to Otters revolves around Valley Floodcaller. However, the real star of this deck is Furdock Core, a 3-mana artifact that just so happens to be a Kindred artifact shapeshifter, so it's every creature type. It's also an artifact, which makes it hard to interact with. You can see here, you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. it's a mono rock. So whenever you cast a spell, you're going to untap your Otter artifact with Valley Floodcaller. So you can see how this is very similar to the way you do it with like Enduring Vitality and the old Otter shell. Now Sig's command usually wants to deal with merfolk. Well, your Furdot core is also a merfolk, so you can create a copy of it, and now you're generating 2 mana, and for every 1 mana cantrip thing you play like Sleight of Hand, you're generating extra mana. You also, of course, have Roiling Dragonstorm, which if you play a dragon, you can return to your hand to draw 2 cards and discard a card again, which, go figure, Furdot Core is also a dragon. So the deck revolves around Furdot Core. Valley Floodcaller is the way that pumps everything up. You have Boomerang Basics and, of course, Storm Chaser's talent to keep looping through things, drawing a ton of cards, and you basically play it like an Azorius combo control shell. This is something that I think a lot of the Harmonizer players are going to move to if they're kind of frustrated with the results they're getting from their deck, and I expect to see this one pop up in numbers because not only is it a fun combo deck that takes a large majority of the game actions, but it had a 60% win rate across 4 pilots at 2 different events this weekend. Izzet Prowess may just have been the breakout deck of the weekend, as 54 different pilots took the deck to a 57.6% win rate overall, or a 58.2% win rate when you don't factor in the ties. So this B tier popularity deck was one of the most winning decks in the room with double-digit copies, and for good reason. Now this deck kind of harkens back to some of the older iterations of Standard where Slickshot Show Off, Drake Hatcher, and Elusive Otter were running rampant. Well, at least Slickshot Show Off and Drake Hatcher. We haven't seen Elusive Otter in some of these lists for quite some time. But a lot of these decks did go back to the Storm Chaser's Talent Boomerang Basics package, being able to generate a bunch of Prowess Otters on top of Prowess creatures already, and then playing a couple of cantrips like Opt and Sleight of Hand, direct damage like Burst Lightning, and then things like Wild Ride to seal the deal to cross the finish line. Now, post-sideboard, we did wind up having a lot of removal spells to deal with things that were too large for them to fight through, as well as 3 copies of Ral Crackling Wit in one of the 11 3-in-1 performance decks from pilot Gavin Meagher. So that's going to wind up being a way to play a little bit of a longer game, generate even more tokens, and then just being able to storm off and potentially kill somebody with a couple of burn spells across the finish line there. Regardless though, the Prowess deck is fast. It is quite linear, so it's not that difficult to be able to just pick up and play, but there are some very intricate lines that you can walk through in order to navigate through some difficult situations. Stock up is of course present in these lists and helps you find the spells that you need to kill somebody the following turn, while you can just have some quote-unquote nut draws and kill someone on like turn 3 or so. Now, this Esper mid-range deck clocking in with a 57.1% win rate overall is where some of these singleton lists kind of capitalize on how we do these win rate statistics. Now, the Esper mid-range deck went 4-3 before the pilot wound up dropping from the event. However, it's basically a mesh of the Azorius tempo deck and the Dimir mid-range deck kind of thrown together. Although instead of playing High Noon, you're playing Kaito. And instead of playing things like Preacher of the Schism, which you have 1 copy of, you're playing multiple copies of Aang Swift Savior and copies of Voice of Victory. So while it's doing things that both of the decks like doing, it's not really focusing on one game plan or the other. You have copies of like No More Lies, which is a slightly better counter spell than things like, Phantom Interference or Spell Stutter from the Dimir list. You have Get Lost, Bitter Triumph. It's doing a little bit of everything we like, but it's not doing enough of what the decks do well. So unfortunately, it wasn't functioning on all cylinders compared to the other Dimir or the other Azorius list that kind of stayed in one lane. Now, this other singleton list by pilot Kris Wishinski, of the Mono White Auras list, did make day 2 and unfortunately fell to an 8-6-0 record overall. However, some of the best hits from Magic Arena's best of 1 queue kind of pop up here. Optimistic Scavenger, Skyward Spider, Ethereal Armor, Feather of Flight, Sheltered by Ghost. This is tried and true a air quotes Boggles deck that is hoping to be able to put counters on things with Optimistic Scavenger as quickly as possible, play as many enchantments as possible so Ethereal Armor gets things extremely large and looks to aggro people out of the game early. 4 main deck copies of Doorkeeper Thrall are here to stop all of the ETB shenanigans from the Elementals type decks, and a way to kind of protect the creatures from the creatures that ETB and do things that a lot of the decks are playing, like the Rhythm Shells. The sideboard has Clarion Conquerors and Rest in Pieces to really hate on some of the other decks floating around, and the main deck does have 4 copies of Hallowed Fountain and Flood Farm Verge, so you can play some Spell Pierces from the sideboard. So it is labeled as mono white, has a couple of blue spells in there. Regardless, it's a very fun deck to play, especially if you are a little bit more new to Standard. It goes to show that you can day 2 events like this with a deck that in theory seems pretty straightforward. Temur Omniscience by pilot Michael Knie rounds out these 57.1% win rate decks, tied in the top 10 win rate, and this deck also made day 2 and also unfortunately fell short at 8, 6, and 0. Now we've seen decks like this previously where it is the Simic Omniscience Kona shell, but runs Terror of the Peaks in the main deck. Now Michael's list was the only one that I saw that had Terror of the Peaks in the main deck and was labeled Temur, so I kept it that way. But we've seen these decks previously. You're playing Kona Rescue Beastie, you're playing Formidable Speaker to try to find it early enough, you want Lost in the Maze to protect your Kona when you tap it down, you have Omniscience and Meringue River regen so you can kind of bounce back and forth, and Terror of the Peaks is the way that helps you actually win the game a lot faster. Now Michael's list had a couple of interesting cards such as Fear of Imposters in the main deck, which is just kind of a flash counter spell which then allows your opponents to manifest dread, but is a protection thing that you can have that is creature based and not spell based, which means things like Spell Snare because it's 3 mana can't affect it, as well as Negates and Disdainful Strokes because it's not a spell and it's not 4 mana. So it's just an interesting piece of interaction to kind of help protect your combo. Post sideboard, you wind up having a lot of on the stack interaction in this one because your Temur, instead of leaning into bans, you don't have access to like the board wipes and the more control-y type shell, so you're really looking to force through the combo. So Michael's list is something that's a little more combo centric, and if you don't want to switch into the control style sideboard, it might be something worth checking out if you're a Kona pilot. Now we saw the Rakdos version of the Monument deck not having the best weekend overall, but if you splash blue in there for Grixis Monument, you end up having one of the top 10 win rate decks. 56.4% overall win rate, and with pilot Jeff Pyka going 10, 5, and 0 for the highest win rate copy of the deck. I really like this deck. It is very reminiscent of what the Orzhov Greasefang decks are doing, mostly because of Iron Shield Elf being able to discard cards at will to enable all of your Monument to Endurance triggers on each turn. Now Bloodthorn Flail allows you to do it on your turn by having the equip cost of discarding a card, and you just need a creature to attach it to. However, the culmination of all these parts around cards like Moonshadow, while you enable it alongside cards like Inti, Seneschal of the Sun, having Marauding Mako as an early game threat, you wind up now adding Bloodghast and Flamewake Phoenix as cards you want to discard and don't mind having in your graveyard since they come right back, and you basically have a standard Hollow One deck that has a longer game plan. Now speaking of longer game plans, the blue splash in here of course is for Quantum Riddler, as most of the decks in Standard are going to want to do, but you also wind up having post-sideboard interaction. Disdainful Stroke, Flash Freeze, Ill-Timed Explosion as a board wipe for a deck that normally doesn't have anything post 2 or maybe Fire Magic, so that's also a way to get things in your graveyard that you don't necessarily care about being there and you bring them back later on. Also, while you're discarding cards from all these effects, Inti is generating new card velocity by impulsing the top of your deck, and you can cast those spells and kind of keep things chaining down the line to really deal some damage to your opponent. Oh boy, another Rhythm variant. I can't wait to see what 2 main deck cards are different in this one, is what people are probably thinking at this point. And to be completely honest, the Temur Rhythm deck doesn't have a lot of different cards in it compared to the Simic version specifically. Now the Temur deck mainly has a main deck Explosive Prodigy, but it's also packing the Archdruid's Charm package that a lot of the Simic lists have kind of adapted to, because it's basically a base Simic deck and allows you to cast the triple green instant speed spell to do things like search for creatures or fight or things like that. That means it is not running Formidable Speaker, because this is the Formidable Speaker substitute, so to speak. Now in the sideboard, some of the lists are running more of the red interactive package, maybe some burn spells and stuff, but in the highest placing list in 10, 5, and 0 from pilot John Slimak, it was not running anything besides Explosive Prodigy in the main deck. So while you can kind of argue that it's not true Temur, having a couple of iterations and variations on this list and finding ways to keep track of it, not to muddle the different archetypes together, is proving to be a little bit difficult, and we have to kind of break it down into these different sort of things. Now, 7 different pilots still brought this specific configuration over the Simic one, so that is enough to kind of classify it as its own archetype in my eyes. 55.7% win rate overall. When you factor out the ties, it's 56.5%, and second to the 4-color rhythm deck we just saw. Now, if you want to split hairs, let's take a look at another archetype that's kind of going into the different color pairings just for a couple of changes here. Temur Elementals, which unfortunately missed day 2 because of a draw picked up earlier on, going 5, 3, and 1 overall, basically has main deck Herd Heirloom versus the quote-unquote Grixis shells we may talk about a little bit later, which do not have main deck Herd Heirloom. So that means that things like Deceit and Vibrance and Ashling, Roaming Throne, all these different things, we're just kind of looking for cards that are of a color identity that don't fit in the other shells. And Herd Heirloom in this deck is pretty solid. You're able to do some mana fixing. It does only work for creature spells, but thankfully you're playing a deck that winds up playing 20-something creatures, and that's most of your spells. But you also get to give all of these powerful Evoke Elementals later on the ability to not only have trample, but then give you a little bit of card advantage too. The one difference in the list here from the pilot as well is the addition of a main deck Catharsis, which throws white technically into the mix, but I guess with the naming conventions, we kind of thrown that out the window. So give things +1/+1 in haste, making some clutch token blockers in this case we need to, a bunch of different things that we can do with all of these Evoke Elementals. And doubling it, especially with Roaming Throne, to get like 4 of them, it's not the worst thing in the world. Overlord the Mistmoors coming in at 4 can do something like that. So this case, yeah, those ones fly, these are on the ground. Still, you get to make 4 tokens when you evoke that one. So pretty solid stuff. Again, splitting hairs with the actual color combinations, but we need to kind of get this one away from the other decks because it is doing some things different. Now, you may have noticed that a lot of the decks in the previous section were what I like to call one-day wonders. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies of the deck, and they didn't have that deep of a run into the tournament, so we don't have a very large sample size as to test how strong they are against the metagame. Well, this next section is going to be looking at pretty much the exact same win rate statistics that we were looking at previously, only now sample size matters. We are only looking at deck archetypes that had at least 4 or more copies into the room, so you're going to get a better picture of how these decks did against the field, and this is where you're going to be looking for some of those sleeper rogue decks that could break out in the format over the next couple of weeks with some tweaking. Well, when we go to certain sample sizes, the 4-color rhythm deck is still the most impressive one overall, with its very impressive win rate of 60.8% on the weekend. Now, I've linked a different list down below in the description for this one because we mentioned Tristan Wydle-LaRue, who won RC Portland. He was back at it again here in Milwaukee, and though he went 6-3-0 at this event and did not play on day number 2, his deck was doing different things, but similar things to the other 4-color lists. Like, he had a 1 of main deck Explosive Prodigy, whereas the Superior Spider-Man was in the sideboard. Also, if you look at Tristan's sideboard, there are 15 different cards, and some of them are lands. So there's a lot that you can do with this archetype, and a lot of different packages that you can play. I think that's why these 4-color, 5-color, 3-color, whatever you want to call them, the rhythm packages that are not these stock Simic lists are performing so well because they are turning into toolbox decks. You wind up finding your 1 of creature that deals with a certain matchup. You wind up finding your 1 or 2 drop spell that you can tutor up with a Bright Glass Gearhulk or draw and find with like a Formidable Speaker. And you wind up being able to go to town on doing your normal Cub game plan because you've dealt with things that your opponent is doing. I mean, the man in here has a copy of sideboard Severance Priest. So in theory, this could potentially be a 5-color deck considering there's the Explosive Prodigy in the main deck. deck. So basically, this is a Swiss Army knife of an archetype, and I don't know if there's a bad way to build it, because at the end of the day, you're just a cub deck that can run them over at Crater Hoop Behemoth at any given point in time. Okay, so like this Furdot core is an otter and a dragon and a merfolk. I'm not gonna like keep going from the previous iteration of this win rate analysis, but look, this creature combo deck coming out of nowhere with a 60% overall win rate in the hands of 4 different pilots is going to be something you have to know what it's doing in the near future. Post sideboard, it also plays a permission style game to go with the fact that there are 4 copies of Consult the Star Charts in the main deck to dig super deep, as well as basically having some hard counter magic in the main deck. 4 copies of Get Out counter a lot of the creature spells, which means that like a lot of the cub decks and things like that are going to be hit, but also hates out on specific cards like the enchantments that are going to be stopping it, like High Noon. So in the sideboard, you wind up having things like Exercise or Spell Snare or Torpor Orb for the ETB effects on creatures like the Elementals that are going to be evoked in to try to stop it. You have permission like Voice of Victory so that your opponents can't cast things to interact with your combo. And you of course have cards like Split Up so you can destroy all of the aggro creatures that are swinging in at you and play like a bit of a control combo style game. Then if you, of course, you just want to go lean into that a little bit longer, you have Wan Shi Tong Librarian in the sideboard in addition to this. This deck is awesome. I think that's very clear from the way that I'm talking about it, and I think it's going to be a fun deck to see the evolution of. Now, on the flip side, it is easy to hate out. High Noon, especially in the Azorius Tempo deck, is going to absolutely annihilate this deck. And in the main deck, aside from having something along the lines of Seam Rip or Get Out, if you have that one in hand, you're not really going to be able to interact with it. So that's going to be a hard way to deal with things. The uptick in cards like Abrade to deal with Monument to Endurance, to deal with your Furdot core is also going to be something that can hate you out. So while I absolutely love this deck, I don't know how powerful it's going to be when you see the numbers rising and people knowing exactly how to fight it. Now, just like a lot of the other deck archetypes in Standard, and one of the beauties in Standard is the kind of microcosms and small ecosystems within the same deck archetype that are evolving. And while Izzet Prowess was one of the standout decks of the weekend, I mean, 315 wins, 224 losses, 8 ties, a 58.4% wins without ties win rate overall, 54 different pilots, still can't get over how high of a win rate this deck has with that many players. There's still different versions of it floating around. So the list that I've linked below in the description for this one from pilot Asha Mills Emmett, they have been doing something different. There are no Drake Hatchers in the 75 whatsoever, and instead you wind up having copy of Secret Identity in the main board and the sideboard. So that's going to be pumping up your creature into a 3/4 hero that still gets to keep its prowess keyword, or as Slickshot Show Off, gets to keep the Slickshot Show Off +2/+0 in addition to that. So playing that on the Slickshot Show Off is already going to make it a 5/4. So that's pretty powerful in and of itself. There's also a lot of different ways to deal with your opponent's side of things. This version of the deck has a lot more bounce spells into the Floodmaw and bounce offs in the main deck. Other versions are running more Burst Lightnings and Torch the Tower type things. Post sideboard, you're probably still going to see a lot of Spell Pierces, Spell Snares, low mana interaction to protect your threats while also giving them that extra power boost across the finish line, and then various copies of sort of cards you need to kind of keep different decks at bay. Soul Guide Lantern for the Reanimator and specifically the Lessons decks, Rals in different amounts of quantities in order to go for some of the longer games and some of the more grindy matchups or ways that you need to kind of push your game plan a little bit further, and then various amounts of copies of Wild Ride, 2 in the main deck from this specific list, all the way up to 4 in some of the other decks that I've seen. So Izzet Prowess has a bunch of different ways that you can build it, but still functions very similarly because you're just trying to 20 someone as fast as possible. Now, I knew I threw a lot at you previously when talking about the Grixis Monument deck, but here it pops up again as being one of the top 10 win rate decks even when you start factoring in sample size. 22, 17, and 0 record overall on the weekend does just put it slightly above 50% win rate, 56.4%, but with the small sample size, a couple more wins or losses could really change the trajectory of where that win rate goes, plus or minus the 50% side. Now, this deck does function as an aggro deck. Don't get me wrong, it does have ways to play a longer game, but you are going to want to kind of hollow one style yourself into a commanding position early on and use the Monument plan more as a backup or a way to close out the game. Marauding Mako is, of course, your one-drop, quote-unquote, cycler of choice, being able to pump up but stay pumped up because it gets +1/+1 counters to the number of things you're discarding. You want to get things up to your Ferocious 4 power as quickly as possible so your Flamewake Phoenix can come back as many times as you want. Having a 2-power flyer isn't the largest threat in the world, but it does get pretty big with all of your discards and Inti being able to put +1/+1 counters on it as well. Tersa Light Shatter is a pretty powerful card in this deck too, because yes, you have threats that are coming out of your graveyard, but you're still putting plenty of things in there to begin with. So you are going to hit that threshold mark of 7 or more cards in your graveyard, so you can kind of bring one back later down the line. This works specifically well when you have post sideboard and you're putting in a lot of your removal spells. Pumping up a Moon Shadow early on is also going to be extremely beneficial. When you discard a permanent, it could be a land, it could be a Bloodghast, whatever, this thing grows out of control pretty quickly, and you can do cool things in combat if you have your Iron Shield Elf out in play. This deck has legs, and even though it has different versions, some of them not splashing blue for the sideboard cards and Quantum Riddler, I do think that the Grixis version is going to be able to abuse Quantum Riddler on Warp as much as possible because you can very quickly draw 2 cards with it pretty easily, but I think this is the one that has more staying power, whereas the Rakdos version is more of an all-in aggro shell. Now, I know that a lot of people might just skip over this one because it's another rhythm deck. We just talked about it and we were splitting hairs on the classifications, but if you are a rhythm enjoyer, let's take a look at a different deck list from Joseph Puglisi, who went 11-4-0 using this version of the Temur shell. This one has a lot more one-ofs in the deck to do some fun things with, including main deck Surrak Elusive Hunter, which is going to pay you off by drawing a card whenever one of your opponents is going to be targeting your creatures. This is usually a sideboard card, but in this case, it winds up hitting the main deck. Now, we also wind up having copies of Lizard Connor's Curse, which is an interesting card because that one basically comes into play. It's a 5/5 trampler, and you can just basically make something a vanilla 4/4 green creature. This is sort of like an Unable to Scream on a stick that is going to be doing some different things because, well, it makes something a 4/4, so you can shut off your opponents like Grand or something. It makes it big, or you just turn one of your mana dorks into a 4/4 all of a sudden, and then with a Ouroboros on the battlefield, you can absolutely run them over. Speaking of mana dorks, Great Divide Guide is a tutor target in here that turns all of your lands into multicolor mana dorks basically, and any allies you control in your list into mana dorks, including itself. And then you wind up having copies of Formidable Speaker to help find these different things in your deck. In the sideboard, you have 4 copies of Magebane Lizard. So all of these decks that are slinging spells against you, like Lessons and things like that, this is a target that you can just rhythm up and then have on the battlefield. They have to try to interact with it with one of their combustion techniques or something. And if you're able to get rid of their graveyard because of like a Sentinel or something like that, good luck trying to get this thing off the battlefield then. Now, Joseph also had copies of Frostcliff Siege in the sideboard, which is something I've been tinkering with but never really pulled the trigger on at my LGS. This kind of makes sense because you're able to give a bunch of your things haste, so you can like throw down your Ouroboros and swing with your battlefield ASAP. So I think these lists have a lot of room for iteration. I talked about it in the 4-color area, and this is just taking out the white, taking out the black, and just kind of playing tutory, beefy, stompy creatures. I love it. I love the versatility. I could talk more about this, but I'm pretty sure we have like 7 different rhythm archetypes to talk about. Not really, but you know. Oh, hells yeah. Let's talk about Mono Green Landfall. The deck archetype put 5 copies in the top 8 across the 2 events, and 4 of them were in Vancouver, including the one by Pilot January. Her list made the finals of the event, losing to the Dimir Midrange list, piloted by Nielsen Zhang. Now, overall, Mono Green Landfall is smashing standard right now. We had 128 different pilots playing the deck, and when you factor out non-mirrors, it was a 55.5% win rate deck. This is crazy. These are ridiculous VV numbers that it's putting up, and it's basically an aggro deck. I love the things that you can do with this deck, and I love the iterations that the deck is going through. Have you seen how fast you could put out a Sapling Nursery and how difficult that card is to deal with? All you need is a fetch land and you can get value off of it even if your opponent deals with it immediately if it's not on the stack. This deck has value upon value upon value, and the combination of Sapling Nursery, Earthbender Ascension, and Bossing Say means that even if there are 0 creatures on the battlefield, you are not safe from dying. Mightform Harmonizer being able to be warped in and then saved for later. Icesteel Explorer recycling all of your fetch lands that you're able to fetch early and bring them back. Being able to do earth-bending shenanigans with Badgermole Cub or Bossing Say on your fetch lands to maximize your triggers. This deck is a powerhouse, and you're going to have to attack it at its land base and not just the creatures in order to really come back and combat it. Now, one of the things I've been saying for a while is that Demolition Field is significantly underplayed in this format, and if we're able to target a Bossing Say before they earthbend it, or if they don't realize that you have it in your deck and they don't earthbend their Bossing Say, you can cut off a large avenue of attack if you're playing one of these control style shells. But even if you do that, good luck dealing with Sapling Nursery if they're able to get away with that. Good luck dealing with the normal aggro package of Saj Chocobo and Mossborn Hydra, in addition to Badgermole Cub giving them a ton of mana. There's sideboard tech like Archdruid's Charm, some of it in the main deck, some of it in the sideboard. Sandman Shifting Scoundrel. I mean, Paw Patch formations are coming back to combat flyers and all the artifacts and enchantments that are trying to deal with this deck. I just think if you are an aggro-oriented player and you are not considering Mono Green Landfall, you should be. Like, this deck is just the real deal, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. Even if you attack it successfully, it's still going to be a fun deck with a lot of intricate lines that you can play around your opponent's hate with. All right, let's talk Temur Prowess, because in everything, it's basically just Izzet Prowess. And one of the best performing lists from pilot Anthony Lee, shout out to the Carnies, 9, 4, and 1 in Vancouver, was basically the Izzet Prowess deck. It only had the Grove's Bounty part of Elusive Otter. However, some of the other lists were running sideboard cards to deal with artifacts and enchantments that green did have, and this wound up falling into that classification, I think just because of the way they were naming things in Vancouver, but I wound up keeping it that way to kind of keep up with the differentiation between some of these different archetypes. Now, if you wind up looking at some of the versions of the deck that were run in Milwaukee, you have RC winner Alex McIsaac playing a deck you could actually cast his mascot Poison Dart Frog in. Now, unfortunately for Alex, it didn't pan out the best for him. However, if you are going to be packing, ways to deal with cards like High Noon that significantly hinder the power level of this deck specifically, it's being able to be thrown down on turn 2. So unless you have like a way to bounce it back to their hand with an Into the Floodmaw, which Anthony's list is actually not running any copies of in the main deck or the sideboard, you need to be able to have something like a Spell Snare or Spell Pierce to hit it early on. Unless you're splashing the green, you can wind up running any number of naturalized effects in the format. Paw Patch formation is versatile because you can get rid of like opposing Quantum Riddlers that have stuck like earlier or later on in the game, and you can still deal with those kinds of cards that are hating you out. So in general, the Temur deck is just a tiny little variation on the Izzet Prowess deck, and taking a look at how it performed overall, in theory, we could just mash these together and it probably wouldn't affect Izzet Prowess's win rate too much, because 54.1% overall win rate, an additional 33 wins and 26 losses. You already have so many of the Izzet Prowess decks, I don't think it's going to move the needle too far, and it's still going to keep Izzet as a very, very powerful win rate deck. Jeskai pilots, I have a proposition for you. I give you Shiko the Legendary Dragon, you receive a much higher win rate Jeskai control shell. 5 different pilots took this list to a 54.1% win rate, which ties the overall win rate from the previous Temur Prowess deck at a 20-14-3 record overall. Now, all this deck is doing is changing the package of spells a tiny bit to get more value from Shiko Paragon of the Way. So yes, you are going to have a couple of spells that are lower on the mana curve, and you only have a singleton copy of Jeskai Revelation in some of these lists, such as the higher performing 10-4-1 list from Pilot Ellie the Purple. They chose to maximize the amount of 3 or less spells that you could kind of benefit from by casting Shiko. Now, this list still has Meringue River Regen and Wanshitong Librarian, but the main deck of Ellie's list winds up utilizing a singleton copy of River Churn Monument as well, since you're not able to run some of the higher mana cost spells that you might run, such as the Unagi of Kyoshi Island. Well, you can, you just don't get the value of it from Shiko if it's in the main deck. Now, Unagi does live in the sideboard in addition to 2 copies of Kutzel's Flanker and 3 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, all of which you can rebuy with Shiko, and 2 copies of Sage of the Skies in case you want to get a little more mid-range control. If you cast 2 spells, so if you Shiko, it comes into play, and you get a copy of the 2/3 Flying Lifelinker since it's a 3 mana creature. So you can wind up putting those in your graveyard, or you can wind up just having them in your hand and casting them later, or casting them early, having them die to your own board wipes, and bringing them back for a lot more value. Now, I think this is potentially the way you need to play the Jeskai list. You just need to get more things on the battlefield a little bit earlier on, and then get value from the Shiko quote-unquote flashback. You still have the longer game Wanshitong to get your sort of Hydroid, Grixis, Sphinx's Revelation kicks, and you can just play more copies of Jeskai Revelation and sideboard like the one of Fire Magic, the one of Seer, etc., for later games. Boros Dragon's another B-tier popularity list with 50 different copies and an above 50% win rate, 52.7% overall, or 52.8% without mirror matches, 52.9% without ties. It's a very consistent deck, whatever win rate metric you're going to be looking at. Big Bad Dragons do big good things in standard format. Now, being able to play things like Momo Friendly Fire, Sarkhan Dragon Descendant, get your dragons out early, that's well and known. But what else is this deck doing? Because so many different people that I talk to don't recognize the power of the card. Now, I mean, like, some lists are running a one-of copy of Spectacular Tactics, which just protects one of your things, but also functions as a large creature removal spell. But that can't be exactly why the deck is functioning as well as it is. I mean, you have lands that can help you cast dragon spells and search for a dragon, like Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon, but having a tutor in your land base can't be exactly why the deck is doing so well. Now, at the end of the day, you're playing a Boros mid-range deck. The Boros midrange deck has mana ramp because you're creating treasures and reducing the cost of your creatures from Momo. And you have big bad dragons. You can warp in Nova Hellkite and it only costs 2. You can play Magmatic Hellkite and it only costs 3. You can shut off your opponent's interaction because you have 4 main deck copies of Voice of Victory. That's able to create multiple turns where you play a Voice of Victory after you have like a Momo or a Sarkhan in play, and then you play 2 big bad dragons that if they haven't dealt with your Voice of Victory, they can't deal with, and if they dealt with your Voice of Victory, they don't have immediate interaction for. The coup de grace of everything is Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest, because you can just exile a bunch of dragons from the top of your library to get the burn damage that you need to finish the game across the finish line. You are playing copies of Cavernous Souls, so this isn't going to be counterable either, so you're going to wind up getting that ETB from Dragonhawk unless they like Tishana's Tidebinder it or something. The Dragons deck just has a lot of creature-based effects that are extremely powerful in the current standard metagame, and as long as standard looks as diverse as it is right now, it's still going to be that way. I expect this to be kind of like a quote-unquote Jund style deck where it's rocking a 50% win rate regardless of what standard's throwing at it, which is honestly an awesome thing to see in the standard format where people are doing Badgermole Cub and Lessons things or whatever. You just rock up with Sarkhan and his army of dragons and Momo's on his shoulder, and it's still doing awesome things like going 11-3-1 at a regional championship and qualifying for the Pro Tour. All right, let's talk about it. It comes in at number 10 when you factor in sample size. Izzet lessens at a 52.6% win rate on the weekend, and when you factor in non-mirror matches, bumps up a wee bit to 52.9% overall. I've been saying that this is the deck that scales the most with Pilot skill, and as we saw Pilot Max Komanowski play in Milwaukee, he has the reps on the deck. It really goes to show. When it comes to the list itself, it hasn't necessarily had a lot of different changes and iterations. The biggest thing that people can test is, do you play Storm Chaser's talent or not? How many copies of Storm Chaser's talent do you play? A lot of people want me to analyze all the different versions of all the different Storm Chaser's talents. Well, I'm just going to say right here, Max's list had 2. Play 2. End of story. But regardless, the deck in and of itself only really goes through a couple of little changes every sort of event, and it still winds up having a dominating performance. Whether you play multiple copies of Iddlequench in the main deck, do you add in some non-lessons interaction as well? Things like 3 Steps Ahead and Spell Snare made it into Max's main deck, but not others. Your sideboard threats are also going to be where the deck kind of diversifies a little bit. Some people like Ral, some people don't. Some people play Wan Shi Tong Librarian, some people don't. Guess what? Max played both, so you could potentially do that as well. And being able to have access to things like Slag Storm instead of just playing Iroh's Demonstration or Pyroclasm give you a little bit of a bigger board wipe angle if you have to deal with some of the larger threats coming out from some of these rhythm decks or from some of the other creature-based decks. So in and of itself, the Lessons deck is going to be a deck that rewards practicing the list. And if you want to pick up Lessons, you have a lot of ground to cover, and when it comes to some of the top pilots that have been playing it for the past couple of months. Does that mean that you're going to have to play that long to understand the deck and learn its lines? No. Does that mean you could just pick it up and play it after maybe a couple of games at your LGS? Also no. Practice does make perfect when it comes to the Lessons deck, and it will reward you for learning the ins and outs of how it functions, what you can and cannot discard at different points in time, and how to deal with hate pieces based on what you've built your 75 around.
So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head to head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering, online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others.
All right, so Izzet Lessons, I'm, spoiler alert, just not going to do the breakdown of the different Storm Chasers talent counts or whether it does or whether it doesn't in this section. I'm already over an hour long into the video. But looking at the deck as a whole, Izzet Lessons' overall win rate in over 1,300 matches, 52.6%. Cut out the mirrors, 52.9%. We just talked about that in the top 10 win rate section. Looking at how it does against the field, though, it has a field day with a bunch of the Dimir decks, which were extremely popular this weekend. It also is still feasting on some of the Cub decks, 57.3% win rate against the Simic rhythm list altogether. And since it has no creatures that you can Thunderflock away, besides maybe a Grand and some Otters, it's really good against the Izzet Spellementals deck, especially since they're doing some tempo-y things, and if you're packing 3 Steps Ahead and it'll quench you in any number of quantities, you can interact with them for cheaper if you've had a Grand and Lessons in your graveyard. Spoiler alert, it's also very good against the Jeskai control list, because once you have the engine pieces down, you navigate yourself into a situation where you can just kind of start generating value off of those. It's really difficult for the Jeskai player to be able to really do anything to combat you. You're going to be casting cheap cantrip spells and things like that. Counterspelling that feels really bad. They really need to be able to deal with you in the early stages of the game before you have your stuff online. Otherwise, it's a bit of a cakewalk from that point forward. Now, if you are a Lessons pilot, the decks that you are worried about in the room: Mono Green Landfall. That deck is picking up in popularity a ton, and it is one of the losing matchups out of these top 10 presence decks. 46.8% win rate isn't the worst thing in the world, so the sky isn't falling. However, it is something you have to concern yourself with, and you need to kind of understand that matchup a little bit better. Spoiler alert, I don't think there's a lot better to understand. I do think it is slightly Landfall favored. The other deck in the room that is picking up in popularity that you're not happy to see is Azorius Tempo. High noon. The end of the story. You need to have ways to bounce it. You need to have spell snares to interact with it. You need to do something early game like an It'll Quench Ya, and if you don't, High Noon will shut you down. Voice of Victory will also be a pain for you. Angswith Savior and Aven Interrupter aren't anything if you are able to deal with those two kind of limitation pieces, and you can just kind of flourish from there. But those in combination with one another shut you down. Also, interesting to see that the Izzet Elementals deck is a little bit harder for this to deal with compared to the Izzet Spellementals deck. I guess once you're actually resolving a roaming throne, it's going to be difficult for you to deal with since you kind of have to pump a bunch of mana into it, or you need to have a stocked graveyard for a combustion technique, and then they're going to start generating a lot of value with their ETBs. So if you fall behind the curve, they do have Cavernous Souls and things like that. Your interaction, your counter magic isn't going to be as effective as your removal is going to be, so you need to kind of have a game plan established early, otherwise they're gonna like quote unquote Omnath outvalue you. The Izzet Prowess list, I'm not surprised to see this one being a unfavorable matchup for the Izzet Lessons deck. 41.4% win rate, it's the lowest one overall. This deck is fast, this deck is furious, and it gets things done before you can even really put your pieces on the battlefield. So you need to have like your removal, your interaction, everything curving out for like the first 4 or 5 turns to keep yourself safe before you can start even laying down your engine pieces. And if you're doing that, well, you're not really generating the card advantage that we're used to seeing from the lesson shell, so you're already on the back foot, and if they have one last plotted slick shot or something out of nowhere, you're done for. Let's talk about Mono Green Landfall now. We did discuss its Izzet Lessons matchup, but let's see how it stacks up against the rest of the field and where it's successful. Or maybe where it struggles, because it's pretty successful against a lot of the field, to be completely honest. Now, its worst matchup out of these top 10 presence decks is actually the Simic Rhythm deck. So it's kind of been going up in popularity and win rate in parallel with the decline of the Cub-based decks, specifically the Sithim Rhythm decks. Now, 33% win rate overall is pretty abysmal, and one of the things that the Mono Green Landfall deck lacks is interaction and ways to punish opposing creatures. Now, if you leave a Badger Mole Cub deck unchecked, it's going to Crater Hoof you as soon as turn 3. So that could be a big reason as to why this Simic Rhythm deck is a favored matchup for that deck, and the Mono Green Landfall deck struggles against it. You have fight spells and Melt Strider's Resolve and stuff like that in the sideboard. You can trample over a lot of the other creatures in the format, but you're going to struggle when they're Crater Hoofing you turn 3 or 4, or Ouroboros is growing their things all the way across the board as much as your landfall creatures are in and of themselves. Now, against the Izzet Prowess deck, the Izzet Prowess deck is basically as fast as you are, but has interaction for your early drops and has things that mostly fly, which your deck is actually pretty bad at dealing with until you get a Sapling Nursery down on the battlefield, which Izzet Prowess isn't giving you a ton of time to deal with. Now, Slickshot Show Off is a threat that can actually die to Melt Strider's Resolve on most of your things, unless they like Secret Identity it into a 3/4 or buff its toughness by 1 or 2 points due to some like protection spells post sideboard. So it's going to be a rough matchup for you to have to deal with. That deck is fast, and that deck doesn't really care that you're popping lands. Now, where you are trading in speed in some of these matchups, you do have consistency and longevity. I mentioned Sapling Nursery, you have Bossing Say, we talked about that in the popularity tier area. This is what is giving the Mono Green Landfall deck its edge against a bunch of the different slower decks in the format. The Dimirs, the Azorius Tempos, and the control decks of the format have a very hard time dealing with all of these recursive threats, dealing with land threats specifically, specifically, and if you wind up landing a sapling nursery super early, like turn 4 or so, thanks to all these fetch lands giving you forests, it's very difficult for people to A, interact with that unless they have like negate or disdainful stroke specifically, and B, remove it from the battlefield, because how many anti-enchantment cards are they packing against your creature-based aggro deck? So in general, mono green Landfall has a swath of good matchups against the field, but if people are picking the Cub decks back up, mono green Landfall may take a hit to its overall win rate, which is currently 55.5% when you factor out mirrors. The big bad demon deck in the room, Dimir Excruciator, fell in overall win rate as it struggled to find favorable matches across the top presence decks at both of these RCs. A losing head-to-head against the Izzet Lessons mono green Landfall and the Brethren deck in Dimir Midrange, it did wind up having a slightly under 50% win rate against Simic Rhythm, although pretty close to 50%, and then preying upon some of the lesser played of the top 10 presence decks in the room, save for Izzet Prowess, where it was a little bit too slow to deal with the fast aggro deck. Now, it did wind up averaging out to a 47.3% win rate overall, or 47.1% win rate when you don't factor in the mirror matches, so it's not super doom and gloom. Even though you're below that average win rate, you're still not the worst win rate of these top 10 presence decks. We'll get to that one a little bit later. You are, however, going to struggle against the decks that now are packing the interaction to deal with you, that are able to basically kill you faster, like the Prowess deck is going to be able to do and the Landfall deck is going to be able to do, or just decks that can, quote, just basically pound for pound try to deal with your control combo shell. The Izzet Lessons deck is going to be pretty difficult because they have a lot of different angles of interaction. They can deal with some of your smaller things, and like your superior Spider-Men and stuff aren't going to be as powerful if they can just on the stack get rid of the 4/4 creature that you wind up making. And of course, the Izzet Lesson shell is also going to be happy to get some of its spells deseeded away. They want lessons in the graveyard. They only have one creature, and they're really just digging for their engine pieces. The mono green Landfall deck having such a unfavorable matchup for the Excruciator list is kind of interesting to me, but thinking back to what I was saying about the mono green Landfall list, the longevity and the fact that it has a lot of these lands that are able to generate value is something that the Excruciator list has an excruciatingly painful time dealing with, because your Dimir based deck is mostly going to have a lot of spot removal, maybe some bounce spells and some counter magic. Doesn't do too well against 3/4 Tree Folk tokens and bossing Sade up lands, which if they have an Earthbender Ascension on the field, which, spoiler alert, black and blue are not the best at dealing with, you're going to be able to get trampled over pretty quickly. So I think the Dimir Excruciator list still has some legs, but if you're interested in piloting a Dimir-based control deck, I think you cut the combo and look at the Dimir control shell in general. Although I don't think that the Dimir Excruciator deck is like a relic of the past. I just know that the control shell had a slightly higher win rate, and if you enjoy the style of the Dimir Excruciator deck, it's very, very similar, has a higher win rate, and is packing some more interaction for these specific matchups that may shore up some win rates here and there. Dimir Midrange's overall head-to-head matchup matrix is really interesting. Now, overall against the field, it was a 50.1% or 50.4% without mirror matches win rate deck on the weekend, which is pretty average, slightly above average. But looking at its head-to-head matchup matrix, it was a losing matchup against the two most popular decks in the room, one of which it had to beat multiple times in the top 8 and the finals of the Vancouver event. So even though it's not a favorable matchup, it did win when push came to shove, and it really mattered most. But this is why the Dimir deck has been so polarizing. It's not a great matchup into Lessons because a lot of your black-based interaction is just kind of useless against what Lessons is doing. You wind up playing very heavily into the blue side of things, in which case if you tech for that, then your deck becomes less good against like the mono green Landfalls and the Cub decks in the format, which you're trying to kind of hedge against by having black-based removal, especially cheap ones like Requiting Hex. So you're always kind of pushing and pulling, and you almost need to build your deck similarly to the way a control deck works. And thankfully, you do have Kaito and Enduring Curiosity to kind of give you the card velocity to try to find your 1 and 2 ofs in your list if you're teching in those specific ways. But in general, you just really want to be a mid-rangey tempo style deck that is going to capitalize on some of the slower decks in the format. Dimir Excruciator, the Izzet Spellementals deck and the Jeskai control type decks are going to be field days for you. The Azorius tempo deck being a favorable matchup is a little interesting to me because I thought the Azorius deck with its interaction and denial package was going to be the way to go, but they don't have a really solid way to prevent you from Kaitoing or getting rid of your Kaito outside of like Get Lost. And if they get lost that, then they're not getting rid of your Enduring Curiosities or your Growing Creatures. You have your own interaction, like packing Spell Snares and things like that in your Dimir list is already powerful to deal with Cub decks and things like that. However, it also hits a lot of the interactive pieces from Azorius Tempo, which means you're always going mana positive against your interaction and their interaction. You know, like paying 1 mana to counterspell their 2 mana Get Lost is mana positive for you. So I can see how this version of the deck is slightly favored in that matchup. Overall, Dimir, I'm still not like convinced that I should sleeve it back up. But oh, well, looky there. My Kaitos have just magically made it into their sleeve. So I guess I just have to try it out. All right, Simic Rhythm, what's the deal here? Because last weekend, yeah, we had small sample size. All of a sudden, you shot back up to like an above 50% win rate. And here you are dashing my hopes and dreams going below 50% win rate overall again. Let's take a look at your head-to-head matchup matrix and try to dissect what's going on here. And ooh, no! Look, Izzet Spellementals, 18.8% win rate. Yuck, patooey. Well, we all kind of figured that out. I mean, Sunderflock being able to bounce your entire board as soon as like turn 3 or 4 and just upending everything you've done without a real solid way to interact with it. Awful, awful matchup on paper. Turns out the Izzet Elementals deck, they're back in Sunderflock as well. They also have a bunch of different things like Vibrance and stuff to deal with your creatures early game, and when you roaming thrown into one of those things, you can clear an entire Simic Rhythm board pretty darn quick. So those matchups are going to be very, very bad. So the more we see Elementals, the less we're probably going to see Badger Mole Cub in this configuration specifically. Interestingly enough, the Azorius Tempo deck was less of a unfavorable matchup than I thought it would be. I had played a couple versions of the Rhythm decks against Azorius Tempo very recently, and High Noon hurts like a lot. It stops you from doing your multiple spells per turn, setting things up, and being able to kind of play Ouroboros, Crater Hoof to end the game. However, you do have Nature's Rhythm to tutor things like Reclamation Sage to try to deal with it, as long as they've tapped out for it, because if they have 2 or 3 mana, you're going to walk into a No More Lies, an Aven Interrupter, or an Angswift Savior, and then the game's going to kind of spiral out of control from there. It's not unwinnable, especially if you're running things like Into the Floodmaw instead of Bounce Off. It's just going to be a bit more of a difficult matchup, and I'm actually interested to see that it's less difficult than I had experienced, so I'm just playing it wrong, I guess. The rest of the decks in the top 10 presents, you're not necessarily super bad against, you're not necessarily super good against, save for Mono Green Landfall, where you are literally running over the deck that doesn't interact with you whatsoever. You're slightly positive against the Dimir Excruciator deck. They don't have as many of the interactive pieces as some of the pure control versions do, because they're putting their combo in there, and you can kind of skirt away with some of these games pretty quickly, which is why it's over 50% win rate here. But against things like Dimir Midrange that are packing on the stack and on the battlefield interaction for a lot of what you're doing, you're on the slightly lower end of that 50% win rate overall. Some of the other decks, such as Izzet Prowess, they can fly over you. Yeah, you can race them, but that's basically what it comes down to. They have better interaction than you do, specifically in post-sideboard games, and even in the main deck specifically. So it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle if there's a Slick Shot Show-Off and a bunch of Burst Lightnings in your opponent's hand. And of course, Jeskai Control. This might be one of the decks that Jeskai Control actually is very good against, and the more Jeskai that we see, the less Rhythm, Cub, Simic versions of the deck we're going to see. So let's chat about Azorius Tempo, because this deck shot up in popularity overall, and it still has a very decent 50.3% win rate overall, or on mirror. Both of them are pretty much the same. So where is this deck succeeding and where is it struggling now that we get to see a larger sample size of how the deck is playing? Well, we talked about its matchup against Dimir Midrange previously, but that is not its worst win rate matchup overall. It's actually against the Izzet Spellementals list, and this is pretty interesting. Now, the Spellementals list I know has a lot of cantrips, a couple of burn spells, and ways to kind of deal with things. However, The Azorius Tempo deck, if it doesn't have a way to deal with like an Eddy Merc Crab coming down early, it has a lot of small creatures like Voice of Victories and things like that that can slow down casting like the Eddy Merc Crab end of turn, but it doesn't have a lot of ways to deal with Sunderflock. And if you Sunderflock even through a High Noon, if they don't have the right interaction to deal with it, they're not going to be able to beat that. You can just recast the Sunderflock again for like 2 mana the next turn, and they need another piece of interaction to deal with it. And even then, the Spellementals deck has a lot of tempo-based spells, bounce spells, a little bit of counter magic as well, so I can see it actually fighting against the tempo deck a little bit better, and then of course having the bigger, faster clock to finish it. The Azorius Tempo deck actually struggles against the mono-green Landfall deck as well. We talked about Landfall's utility based off of like Bossing Say, Earthbender's Ascension, and Sapling Nursery. So being able to deal with lands entering the battlefield is something that High Noon, counter spells, and even bounce spells really can't deal with. So the Azorius Tempo deck doesn't have the clock to race this deck and doesn't have the tools it really needs to consistently stop the Landfall deck from doing what it wants to do. So that's going to be a bad matchup for it as well. But where it does wind up succeeding is in the control matches, in the matches that want to take their time, like the Izzet Elementals list that is accruing a lot of value by ETB effects and sort of quote-unquote omnathing itself into a favorable position, and against the most played deck in the RCs, which is the Izzet Lesson Shell. High Noon really does hurt that deck, and they have to be able to try to find a way to deal with it. If you're able to deal with their engine pieces with your interaction, even if you don't have a High Noon on the battlefield, it's going to significantly slow down the way that they can win. And as long as you can deal with a couple of their removal spells, getting rid of your already slow-ish clock, get yourself in a position where Abandoned Air Temple is really helping you close out the game, or a flipped Aang Swift Savior can really help close out games pretty darn quickly for the Azorius deck in this matchup. Izzet Spellementals? 51.4% non-mirror match win rate is pretty good for the overall on the weekend, and its top 10 presence matchups are pretty polarizing, which can go to show why it's around that 50% win rate. Now specifically, the top 3 presence decks in the room are all decks that it has a losing head-to-head matchup into. The Mono Green Landfall list, the Izzet Lessons list, and the Dimir Excruciator list. A lot of these decks don't really care about Sunderflock, which is why they're going to be a little bit harder. The Mono Green Landfall might be the one that cares about it the most, but the other ones can kind of ignore it. So if you're able to deal with it on the battlefield, its powerful ETB doesn't do a lot in that head-to-head, which is why we see this Spellemental deck struggle, because yeah, you're playing like a Thing in the Ice tempo style deck, but when your Thing in the Ice is just like a powerful beater that they can bounce or burn or counter, doesn't really matter as much, unlike against the more creature-based decks. Azorius Tempo, Simic Rhythm, even Dimir Midrange has a decent amount of creatures on the battlefield. Sunderflock's gonna whoop them all back to hand and really set them behind, and then your Tempo deck shell really shines from there because you keep them off basically doing anything that they want to do from that point forward. Now, unsurprisingly, the worst win rate overall is against the Izzet Elementals deck because, well, when you're trying to bounce all non-elementals and that's your main way to victory, playing against a deck full of elementals, probably not the best for you. Izzet Prowess is actually a matchup that you have a slightly winning head-to-head win rate against, and this could potentially just be because you are pretty fast, you bounce the Prowess things that they have on the battlefield, they're not going to be able to accrue as much value off of Otter tokens because you wind up Sunderflocking or just putting big beefy creatures in their face, and you have a decent amount of tempo interactive spells that you can burn away or counterspell what they're doing in the first couple of turns, and you want to have those instants and sorceries in your graveyard anyway. So it's not surprising to see that this deck has a slightly favorable matchup when you're basically a tempo deck going against an aggro deck. Some games they're going to basically nut draw you to death, and other games you're going to be able to deal with what they have, and you have a couple more spells to do that than they do. Jeskai Control, an unfavorable matchup for the Spellementals list, another deck that doesn't really care about your creatures, so yeah, it's going to be really difficult to kind of close the door on that one there. You don't really have any burn spells that hit their face, and a lot of your interaction is burn-based removal spells, so you're not really going to have a lot of targets for them, so you don't fill your graveyard as fast as you would normally do in some of these other matches. I really like referring to Izzet Elementals as like an Omnath list because you have ETBs out the wazoo and you're just doing a bunch of really cool things. I mean, it's actually probably more similar to an Up the Beanstalk deck. And can you imagine how powerful this deck would be if Up the Beanstalk was still around in the format? Anyway, I digress. Let's look at the top 10 win rate or matchups head to head here because overall the deck is still just around average, 50.6% when you're factoring in non-mirror matches, but it is attacking an interesting kind of swath of the top 10 metagame. It is doing decent against Izzet Lessons. Wistfulness is a pretty big house against Artist Talent and Monument to Endurance, and then you just wind up having ways to burn away their Grand early on, Vibrance as well with that. Roaming Throne is very difficult for their burn-based removal to deal with, especially with its early ward cost. They're not going to be able to deal with that until later on. You already accrued some value off of it, so not surprised to see the Elementals list having a slightly favored 56.7% head-to-head win rate here. Simic Rhythm is another one. You burn away their cubs early, you stabilize, you double your ETBs. They really can't recover from that. Sure, you can wind up getting Crater Hoof pretty early on if you wind up having like an Ashling setup early hand and you go like Ashling, Roaming Throne, pass, you can get Crater Hoof. But if you keep a hand like that and you know you're playing against Simic Rhythm, that's a little more on you. You have a lot of interactive spells for this matchup that you can deal with them. Izzet Spellementals? We talked about that previously. You're pretty Sunderflock immune, so you got a good head-to-head there. And against Jeskai control, it's actually a little more interesting to see it such a high win rate. Normally would think that these like more mid-rangey ETB style decks are going to be a little bit lower in the win rate, maybe closer to 50-50, but these decks are packing something pretty interesting, probably a bunch of deceits and things like that to deal with what the control deck is doing. Now, where you struggle, unfortunately, the up-and-coming Izzet Prowess deck, they're pretty fast, and a lot of your elementals don't necessarily jump, so you can't really hit things like Slick Shot Show Off, and unless you have a Vibrance that you're able to play on a Slick Shot that is unprotected, you don't have a lot of removal until you really get into your sideboard for like instant-based threats and things like that. Mono Green Landfall, kind of similar. A lot of their things, if you burn away their mono dorks, you slow them down a little bit, but when you get into like the grindy later stages of the game, if your creatures are just kind of sitting there as 4/4s and not necessarily accruing the value, like Wistfulnessing away Earthbender's Ascension and things like that, or maybe Wistfulnessing away a Sapling Nursery, you're going to get outvalued by just their lands and everything, and at the end of the day, you could have 4/4s, 5/5s, 6/6s out the wazoo, but if you wind up having like a Mightform Harmonizer Mossborn Hydra that's swinging in for arena number breaking amounts of damage, you really can't put up that much of a defense against it. The Dimir decks are also surprisingly good against you. I'm more interested in the Dimir mid-range list being even more favorable than the Dimir Excruciator list. I figured the control-based shell would be the one that kind of, controls the game and has more of a gameplay against these ETB heavy creature based deck, but the mid-range deck, which I guess has a faster clock and can close the game with a Kaito or something a lot quicker, is harder for the elemental deck to deal with overall. Now, the Izzet Prowess deck had a breakout weekend here at Double RCs, and part of that was because of its awesome head-to-head matchup matrix against the top 10 presence decks. 58.2% non-mirror win rate overall is also really, really solid. But looking at these decks, the only one that it had a slightly losing matchup to, and I say slightly because it's 48.5%, is the Izzet Spellementals list. It was doing well into Lessons and Landfall, which is a difficult spot to be in the format in general, but it was also beating up on Dimir and Simic Rhythm. So this is the deck that is attacking the top presence portions of the metagame. Now, where you're going to have to kind of see if you struggle against is going to be some of the other removal-based aggro decks. The red decks in general is something that I'm going to be kind of looking at and questioning, because the speed of this deck and the fact that you can kind of knock somebody out early on is going to be where the power from the deck comes overall. However, if you are going to be playing against something that that has the ability to, say, burn your creatures slightly early on, like something along the lines of, let's say, the Boros Dragons deck, you may wind up in a slightly losing matchup. And taking a look, I'm cheating here because this isn't on the head-to-head matchup matrix, but the head-to-head against Boros Dragons in a list that has a lot of burn-based removal spells, it's 53.8% in the favor of the Boros Dragons deck. So, the Izzet Prowess deck is doing a very good job of attacking what is popular in Standard right now. Does that mean that you should all immediately switch to this deck and play at your RCQs? Not quite. I do think that the Izzet Lessons deck, if you start taking some of those main deck counter spells out and moving it more towards main deck burn spells, it gets a slight edge against the Izzet Prowess list, because right now you're running like 3 Idle Quenches, 2 3 steps aheads, and a Spell Snare or something along those lines. You can keep the Spell Snare, but if you wind up putting in like Torch the Towers and things like that, it's going to be a little more difficult for the Prowess deck to keep up with. So burn-based removal, requiting hex type things, a little bit more difficult for this list to deal with, but the speed is undeniable, and it is the faster deck out of all of these top 10 presence decks, even faster than Landfall and potentially Simic Rhythm can be. So I think this deck is going to pop up a little bit more. Is it unbeatable? No. Is it a really solid meta call if you're a top heavy in Excruciator, Lessons, and Landfall at your local scene? Yes. Jam it and get that RC invite. Jeskai control players, I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the top win rate section. I think it's time to hang it up and bring Chico back into the list. The strict Jeskai control decks had the worst win rate overall out of all of these top 10 presence decks. And when I say worst, it was pretty abysmal. 33.1% in non-mirror matches. You're winning 1 in 3 matches. You're not day 2ing with this deck if you have that sort of record. Looking at the head-to-head matchup matrix, you are good against Simic Rhythm, which was on the decline. It picked back up. That's like the one matchup you have in here that you should be winning a lot. You only played it 19 times, though, because you did have less Jeskai control pilots overall. There were only 53, I believe, at the event. So, yeah, you're not going to run into it as frequently, but you had a 52.6% win rate. It's still not as dominating as it used to be. And the Izzet Spellementals deck, you're beating up on that one. That one is kind of surging in popularity. You have a 69.2% win rate against that deck, since it doesn't do a whole lot with the main package of cards against the Jeskai control shell. Don't think that changes too much if you pack Shiko in your deck, though, either. What I do think changes, though, is you have a better matchup into, like, the rest of the field here. I think it's better against the Dimir and Azorius style decks. You have more cheap burn spells and interaction to deal with some of their earlier things. You have more cheap counter magic early on to deal with some of their earlier things. I don't know if it really changes the Excruciator matchup all too much. You are putting threats on the battlefield so that they have to kind of interact with them, and you are going to have a little bit more to deal with that they might not be able to just sideboard out all of their removal, and some of their dead cards could potentially be left in certain circumstances. And against the Landfall deck, you at least have a way to recur some of your interaction for what they're doing to try to stave off the threat of their recursive lands and earthbending ascension type threats over and over and over again. In general, I don't know how much your Lessons matchup is actually going to improve by doing this. Maybe if you switch to the mid-rangey shell and you have Angs and stuff like that in your list, it could be a little bit better. But overall, you need to do something different with your Jeskai list. I don't think pure control is the way to go. If you want to play control, try looking at the Shiko list. If you want to play Jeskai in a different way, try looking at the Jeskai mid-range list, which some of them are packing Shiko. They have Aang, they have Gwen. They just have more kind of proactive plays to do. Far be it for someone to call Standard a boring format with all the bunch of different decks and the success and waning win rates of different ones throughout this iteration of both of these regional championship events, as well as just what's been going on in the entire season for Standard. It's a pretty exciting time, and there are still store championships and RCQs to be played, so I want to know, what are you playing in Standard? Has something from these regional championships caught your eye, or is there something that is kind of flirting under the radar that you do want to talk about? Let me know in the comments down below the video here. And while you're there, you can give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this content, so I know to keep making all of these metagame recaps, because you guys will keep watching them in that case. I sure hope so anyway. But if you are looking through all of these decks and you of course want to find something that you want to buy and build on your own, I would highly suggest using my ManaPool link down below in the description. Not only will you get benefits to when you order, but it'll also help me out here as a ManaPool affiliate. So if you see any of the decks that you want to build from this video, or just some cards that you may want to pick up before they spike in price, use the link in the description down below to help us both out and get those cards through ManaPool. Now, of course, if you would like to, you can click the join button down below the video there or on my channel's homepage to become one of my members. Members monetarily support this and all videos on my channel, and through their support, they also get members-only benefits such as Discord access for higher tier members in order to chat about your deck list, talk about the events that you're going through, or just kind of shoot the breeze while we're going through our work days and keep each other sane in this time and trying period. However, we also do get access to members only content and posts on my YouTube community page. I've gone through what I thought were going to be decks to kind of beat the last couple of weekends, as well as kind of some recaps as to the decks that I'm playing and some thought process behind that, including a big old Dimir mid-range thing from last RTQ season standard that's somewhat applicable in the current day and age still. So if that is something that entices you, you can click join down below this video or on my channel's homepage to show your devotion. Now, of course, I'd love it if you could just tap that subscribe button. Helps you stay up to date on all sorts of metagame analysis, deck techs, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content from me. See you in the next recap.